Welcome to the Library of Ideas, produced by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. In this 7th episode, we return to the beginning, to a world where economy was not yet a science of profit, but a philosophy of order and proportion. In the ancient Greek imagination, economy was moral before it was mathematical. For Aristotle, oikonomia, the art of managing the household, belonged to ethics and politics, not to calculation. Its purpose was harmony within the oikos, the living cell of the polis. To govern well meant to balance needs, duties, and virtues, seeking the good life for the whole community, rather than enrichment for one man. Against this stood crematistics, the pursuit of wealth for its own sake. Aristotle regarded it as a corruption of natural exchange, the transformation of need into greed. Money, he warned, was a measure, not a source of value. When it began to multiply itself, the moral order dissolved, the measure replaced the meaning. Thus, in classical thought, economic life was inseparable from moral life. To manage a household, a city, or a state was to preserve the balance between sufficiency and excess, justice and desire. The philosopher's suspicion of accumulation echoed through the centuries, shaping both Christian theology and medieval ethics. For more than 2 millennia, this vision held, wealth was to serve virtue, not replace it. Balance, not abundance, was the mark of wisdom. Well, only much later would oikonomia lose its moral soul and become economics in the modern sense, a system stripped of conscience, devoted to efficiency and growth. Yet hidden in its Greek root lies a forgotten truth. Economy was born not from calculation, but from conscience, not from greed, but from proportion. It began as a moral art disguised as management, a reminder that before humanity learned to produce, it had first to learn to live rightly. Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the Library of Ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment. In the medieval world, the market was not a neutral arena of contracts, but a moral theatre watched by God. Every exchange carried spiritual weight. The merchant's honesty, the craftsman's precision, the buyer's intention, all were matters not only for balance sheets, but for confession. The church stood as the moral guardian of commerce, charged with reconciling necessity with salvation. At the center of this supervision stood the idea of the iustum pretium, the just price. It was never a fixed number, but a living balance shaped by conscience, need, and fairness. To sell too dear or to buy too cheap was not merely unfair, it was a sin, a wound to the very fabric of justice. Behind every coin lay a question of salvation. Could profit ever coexist with purity? Usury, the charging of interest, became the darkest of moral shadows. To make money breed money was to usurp God's dominion over time. The usurer, in sermons and in art, was painted as both thief and heretic, one who profited from eternity itself. Yet within this vigilance, trade began to evolve. Pilgrimage routes turned into trade routes. Markets rose beside monasteries. Fairs gathered relics and goods in the same square. Merchants and craftsmen, once viewed with suspicion, began to see their diligence and fairness as forms of virtue. Well, even profit could be sanctified if earned through honest labor and governed by conscience. Commerce became a moral trial, a crucible where salvation and self-interest were tested together. Thus, the medieval conscience gave the economy its first theology, a vision of trade not as rivalry, but as participation in divine order, where every exchange echoed the harmony of creation itself. Few ideas capture the medieval mind more clearly than the iustum pretium, the just price. For Thomas Aquinas and his successors, every act of exchange had to reflect not merely consent, but justice itself. Price was a moral mirror, a reflection of the balance between human need and divine order. To deceive, to exploit ignorance, or to profit from another's desperation was not only unfair, it was a sin. Value, in this early vision, was an ethical relationship before it was an economic calculation. As trade expanded and life grew more complex, a new dilemma emerged. Who determines what is just? Aquinas grounded justice in the common good, anchored in natural law, an order thought to flow directly from God. But by the 16th century, the theologians of Salamanca began to see that fairness could not be dictated from the pulpit or the throne. They argued that a price was just when it arose freely, when neither side deceived, coerced, nor monopolized. Justice, they claimed, was not imposed from above, but discovered through voluntary exchange. This was a quiet revolution. Justice migrated from divine decree to social interaction. The market, once a moral suspect, became a moral forum, a court where fairness was measured not by command but by consent. Well, the iustum pretium thus evolved from a heavenly constant into a living equilibrium. The first whisper of what later thinkers would call the invisible hand. By transforming divine justice into human fairness, the scholastics laid the groundwork for modern value theory. The price of a thing ceased to be a reflection of its essence and became a measure of its context, the ever-shifting harmony between desire, scarcity, and freedom. For centuries, the lending of money was entangled with sin. To profit from time was to steal from God, for time itself was his creation. Medieval theology saw the usurer as a blasphemer, one who tried to make the passing hours bear fruit like a field. Money, unlike land or labor, was lifeless. To demand payment for its use was to deny the natural order. Lending without interest was praised as charity. Lending for profit was condemned as usury, the theft of divine rhythm. Yet as commerce and risk expanded, that rigid morality began to fray. Merchants, voyagers, and early bankers faced a new reality. Lending involved danger. A ship might sink, a debtor might vanish, a coin might lose value before its return. The thinkers of the late Middle Ages, especially those of the school of Salamanca, began to reinterpret the ancient ban. Risk, delay, and opportunity cost were not crimes against God's time, but reflections of human vulnerability, circumstances deserving fair reward. This reasoning quietly redrew the moral map of Europe. Interest ceased to be a mark of greed and became a measure of prudence. To lend was no longer to exploit, but to trust, an act of rational faith in the future. The forbidden fruit of usury ripened into the credit system. Promise itself became a commodity. The future, a tradable good. This was the moment when time entered the marketplace, not as divine property, but as human potential. By sanctifying credit, the West transformed restraint into invention, the moral act of believing that tomorrow could repay today, and that faith, when measured carefully, could become the foundation of prosperity. In the Italian Renaissance, faith and calculation ceased to be enemies. The merchant, the monk, and the mathematician began to speak a common language, one of proportion, order, and accountability. The counting house and the chapel became two chambers of the same moral heart. Profit was no longer condemned outright, but examined, its legitimacy weighed by balance, purpose, and conscience. Florence, Venice, and Genoa became the laboratories of this synthesis. Their workshops, contracts, and ledgers fused the sacred with the secular through discipline rather than dogma. Accounting evolved into a moral science, teaching that every debit must find its credit, every gain its reason. Mathematics no longer belonged solely to geometry or astronomy. It now measured fairness, trust, and the invisible rhythm of exchange. To write a ledger honestly became as virtuous as to compose a hymn. The same mind that painted angels in perspective learned to balance accounts with divine symmetry. Thinkers like Luca Pacioli and patrons like the Medici embodied this reconciliation. They saw no conflict between geometry and grace, between calculation and compassion. To count was not to doubt God, but to imitate his precision, to seek harmony in the language of number. Commerce, art, and theology shared a single conviction: that reason could reveal the moral structure of the universe. This was the moment when capitalism acquired a conscience. Wealth ceased to be the enemy of virtue and became its test. the proof that prosperity could serve the good if guided by wisdom. The Renaissance thus forged a new vocabulary of economics, one where responsibility justified prosperity and the bookkeeper's pen joined the painter's brush in the shared labor of creation. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern age, the moral language of economics shifted its tone. The merchant's conscience yielded to the minister's calculus. Virtue, once measured by fairness, was now judged by efficiency. The question was no longer, is gain just? But is it useful to the state? It was a quiet revolution, one that turned salvation into strategy and morality into management. The rise of mercantilism completed the transformation. Gold became the measure of power and trade the theatre of sovereignty. Kings and councils sought to regulate exchange, hoard bullion, and command credit. Profit, once the private trial of a soul, became a public weapon in the contest of nations. Where monks had balanced accounts before God, bureaucrats now balanced them before the crown. The moral center of Europe drifted from the confessional to the treasury. Economists of the coming age would speak less of justice and more of balance of trade, less of sin and more of surplus. Even religion adapted. Divine providence began to look suspiciously like economic fortune. In this new world, wealth no longer needed forgiveness, it demanded admiration. The merchant became the citizen, the banker, the counselor of princes. The conscience that once sanctified labor now served policy. Well, thus Europe crossed the threshold of modernity, from a civilization that sought to justify profit through virtue, to one that justified virtue through profit. The moral art of economics gave way to the science of power, and the age of conscience faded into the age of control. And yet, beneath every calculation, the echo of that older question remains. Not how much can we gain, but what is the worth of what we gain? Thank you for listening to the Library of Ideas, a project of the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. New episodes appear every Wednesday and Saturday, reflections for those who believe ideas still shape our world. Join us next time for Episode 8. The Moment God Left the Market, the first lecture in Chapter 2, The Birth of Modern Economics. We'll witness how the divine order withdrew from the marketplace, and how reason, ambition, and empire rush to fill the silence. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning. And remember, once God left the market, it was up to us to balance the books.